All right. Welcome everyone again. So up next we have Alex Segal. He is a Cal Poly Pomona alumnus as well as a Swift alumnus. He now works at HP as a privacy engineer. He's going to go over privacy and security postures and programs with you guys.
Hello, can you hear me all right?
Yep. Well, it's a bit low.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, great.
And you should have, sorry, you should have screen sharing permissions.
All right, cool. Can you see this?
Yep.
Okay. So I slightly changed it to security and privacy programs at for-profit businesses because all of the companies I've worked at so far have been for-profit businesses, and it might be slightly different at
Okay.
other institutions. So welcome everyone. I was a student at Cal Poly from 2009 to 2015. And in 2013, I attended a workshop at Cal Poly run by a guy from Raytheon that inspired me to pursue a career in information security. I did my undergraduate research under Dr. Hussein as part of PolySec Labs, and hopefully you guys find this presentation informative. So this is a slide from that presentation in 2013. The guy walked us through kind of using Metasploit and some things like that. And I really, really loved it. And it kind of set the direction of my career. And so from there, I attended some conferences in Las Vegas, DEF CON and Black Hat. And I attended a talk by a guy named Dave Kennedy, where he went over something called the Teensy attack. That little chip you can see inside the mouse there is an Arduino board. And you can basically inject arbitrary commands into any computer that this mouse gets plugged into. So he would use it to launch PowerShell and pull down a base64 encoded, reverse TCP or Metasploit shell. And so I replicated that and I brought it to Dr. Hussein saying, this can be my research project. And he told me replication isn't research. So he had me try and transition this attack vector to Bluetooth mice and keyboards. So from there, when I graduated, I presented my undergraduate research at a conference called DerbyCon. And then I was hired at Tinder as a security engineer. From there, I went to Apple as a privacy compliance engineer. And then I became director of security at an Andreessen Horowitz funded fintech startup. And then I left there to become a privacy engineer at HP. So for the purpose of this talk, I've defined information security as the practice of keeping information protected from unauthorized access or alterations, and privacy to mean control of your information and the ability to choose who it is shared with. This is a quote from Bill Hewlett, and it says, "Profit, as far as I am concerned, is a state of mind. It is not something that the boss is harping on. Instead, it is something that each person in the organization must be convinced is in his own best interest." And personally, I have found working for profitable organizations to be, kind of a plus. And so I would encourage all of you to keep in mind kind of as you're building information security or privacy programs at different companies, if they're for-profit companies, they really want you to understand how you can use your skills and discipline to enable the business. So this was me at Tinder. My boss, Tony Tremor, used to always tell me that Tinder was not a real job. They would have puppy parties at the office and various other things like that. And certainly some of the other environments I've worked in since then have been much more corporate. And if I could go back in time, I would tell myself to kind of appreciate the culture there a little bit more. One of the other things Tony used to always tell me was, "I pay you to think." He was in the Army, and he said that while he was in the Army, sometimes, if someone had an idea, they'd say, "Well, we don't pay you to think." And he would always tell me, that in tech, I should never get told that I don't get paid to think. Developers don't get paid to type. Security people don't get paid to set settings in AWS. You get paid to think about, the kind of software you should be writing, about the type of threat actors that might be, interested in causing your company financial or reputational harm. And then also, how does what you're doing play in with the greater business? And so some of the notable articles about the way Tinder thinks about privacy and security, these are public information. And so one of the things that comes up every so often is that Tinder doesn't send your photos over HTTPS. And those get written up in an article or reported in a bug bounty. And then Tinder doesn't really do anything about it, right? Because it's engineering work to make that change. And from Tinder's perspective, when you put a photo on Tinder, your intention of that photo is for it to be shown to strangers, right? There's no private photos on Tinder. They're put on your profile to be shown to other people as potential matches, right? And so HTTPS would be a security measure to preserve the privacy of those photos. But because we don't see those photos as private, it's not a step that we take, right? Similarly, a reporter asked Tinder for a GDPR access request, and they got a ton of information back, right, including all their message content. And so the ability for a company to see your message content is a lot of times an organizational or policy choice, right? And why do companies want to see your message content? Well, sometimes, they want to scan that content to use it for advertising. But a lot of times, there's concerns around users want us to keep their data safe, but they also want us to keep them safe. And so things like anti-fraud, anti-bot, and content moderation can all benefit from the organization being able to see your message content. For instance, on Tinder, there was a big bot problem sometimes. And one of the things these bots do a lot of time is, they'll send you a couple messages and they'll post a link, which very often is trying to get your credit card details or login information or something like that, right? And these links will change constantly and, they'll be regenerated. So it can be hard to catch them by, a specific link. But most users, A, they don't post links in the chat that early. And B, if they do, it's one of the top 500 or top 1,000 most visited sites, right? The majority of web traffic is actually to these sites, right? So if you see someone posting maybe Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, potentially they're legit. But if you see someone posting just a random alphanumeric string as a link, well, they're probably a bot, right? And so that ability to access the message content can help the business perform kind of these other functions. And so I updated my LinkedIn, and all the jobs I've gotten since then have been through LinkedIn. I definitely highly recommend using and maintaining your LinkedIn profile. And at the time, Riot was hosting a lot of the OWASP meetups in the area. And so this was Jared, who also went to Cal Poly. And I was definitely super interested in potentially working for Riot Games. I really love League of Legends. I play a lot of it. But I got this LinkedIn message about privacy opportunities at Apple. I hope you can see how nervous I am in that photo, which was before I went and interviewed. And I spent a lot of time thinking about, where I would want to go work next. And there were a lot of reasons to go to Apple. They had the best consumer privacy program in the world. I grew up in the Bay Area, and kind of returning to Silicon Valley felt like, returning to the center of tech. So the first day I got there, I went through the orientation and I met my boss, and he said, "Hey, it's really nice to meet you. Unfortunately, unexpectedly, I have to go to Australia." And that really kind of set the tone for my time at Apple. And what happened was the Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, was talking about encryption, which has been kind of a constant fight there. And he said, "Well, the laws of Australia prevail in Australia. I can assure you of that. The laws of mathematics are very commendable, but the only law that applies in Australia is the law of Australia." And so essentially what he was saying is, despite all the encryptions, specialists and cryptographers and, engineers telling him, "Hey, you can't write a backdoor just for the government. The laws of mathematics don't allow for that." And he's basically saying, well, if we write a law in Australia that does, the laws of mathematics shouldn't matter. And so my boss was kind of in the unfortunate situation of going and explaining to the most powerful man in the country, kind of natural laws apply everywhere. And that sort of thing has happened in the United States as well. This was after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And one of the representatives up there is Apple. And my boss at the time, is in the audience somewhere here. In the original photo, he was actually circled, so I blacked all that out. And so my primary responsibility at Apple was this GDPR compliance program and the data and privacy program. And so we put this screen into the out-of-box experience for the iPhone. And then in various different applications, we put this icon, with some text to inform the user about how their data was collected, purpose for collection and processing, any third parties the data might be shared with, and retention timelines. And there's kind of this layered approach where you can find out how Apple's using your information. And so this was the day the GDPR came into effect, May 25th, 2018. That's my office mate, Rakesh. And it was definitely, a very interesting time to see kind of how all the tech companies, I don't know if you remember, but at that time, basically every single tech company was sending you an email, our privacy policy has been updated. So if you ever go back through that and look at kind of that time period, you'll see a ton of updates related to this. So some of the interesting articles related to Apple, certainly the San Bernardino case. This is something I remember very distinctly. I was in Pomona at the time, and most of you probably know, if you're driving on the freeways around there, a lot of them say, you're going towards San Bernardino. So it was just right next door that it happened. And also in some of the early, interviews I had, people would ask me, kind of how I felt about this philosophically. And then the second article was about the revamping of the privacy controls for the GDPR. And this actually was on the front page of Bloomberg News in March of 2018. And so my grandma doesn't understand a lot about software, information security, or privacy, but she was certainly, understood what making the front page of Bloomberg meant and was very proud of me. And then one of the other things is a FBI forensic examiner calls Apple jerks and evil geniuses for encrypting iPhones. And this was something that actually kind of affected me at the time while I was working there. Certainly, I always want to feel that what I'm doing in privacy and security is kind of for the good of people as a whole. And, it definitely affected me to constantly have governments around the world, Australia, America, kind of call us evil geniuses or terrorist enablers or things like that. And this was something that was very interesting about working at Apple, is that, there was a period of time, right, where people thought Apple was going to go out of business. And so even as we were pushing $1 trillion valuation, a lot of the people, especially people, who are high up in finance there, they remember when Apple can barely make payroll. So it's definitely a company that is like very conscious of, they're doing super well now, but they could be failing at any moment. And so, they always retain their focus on product excellence to avoid that. So after the kind of GDPR compliance program was built and went more into maintenance mode, I was offered an opportunity to kind of build something else that I thought was really great. It was a fraud detection startup, and I was the sole practitioner for a company that already had 40 million social security numbers and address histories. And I just kind of want to say that that was extremely stressful to have, that level of responsibility around, if there were any misconfigurations in AWS, that could potentially lead to this information leaking. And then, any type of safeguard to detect that mixed configuration by other engineers and things like that, I was responsible for making sure that was set up. So I was constantly worried about the potential of something going wrong. We had a SOC 2 attestation, which was really good for a startup at such an early stage. And there was something called the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which is related to the financial sector that I had not been exposed to before. And so GLBA compliance was another thing that was definitely stressing me out in that position. And so one of the things I was really responsible for, this was kind of the first time in a while I'd been working for the little guy, so to speak. All the previous companies had revenue measured in hundreds of millions or even hundreds of billions of dollars. whereas this company was still trying to become profitable. And so I kind of been on the other side of the table a lot, where vendors had to prove to us that they had adequate security programs. But now I was on the side of, I had to prove to these other companies, especially banks, that our security program was adequate. HP reached out to me asking if I wanted to come be a privacy engineer there. And initially, I declined because I was really enjoying what I was doing at the fintech startup. But my dad kind of took a turn for the worse in his health, and he lives up here. And I'm based in Washington now. And so I reached back out to them. I was like, actually, it seems like kind of a good time for me to move up there if you still have that opening. And I did all my interviews for this company remotely, which I thought was very interesting. Apple had flown me up for an on-site. Tinder, I'd known some people there before. And then my boss is actually based in Idaho, whereas I'm based in Washington. And I think that's something that has kind of served us really well as we've transitioned into full remote working, kind of during COVID, is that our HP was already running a distributed workforce. I thought this was something that was interesting. A Q&A with Steve Wozniak, where they were talking about Apple Park being built on old HP lands. And he was saying that Steve Jobs kind of always favored a campus in one place, whereas he personally preferred HP's more distributed and independent divisions. And for me personally, Apple Park is a beautiful building, but working with 12,000 other people in a building made entirely of glass was overwhelming, right? You'd be seeing thousands and thousands of people a day, and there was basically no privacy yourself. You go in the office, close the door, and the door and the walls are made of glass. So this is the HP Smart App disclosures. As you can see, like, we've got a lot more first layer disclosures than Apple does. And I think that's kind of a side effect of, we wanted really hard to be compliant, and they were much more focused on kind of the user experience aspect. And now we're trying to do a lot more like, how can we reduce the user friction? So I think this is a good example of kind of a design that satisfies all the privacy requirements, but we're still working on how can we reduce the amount of user friction we're introducing to satisfy our privacy requirements, which is always something to think about. Another thing that's happened is Apple has published some guidelines for app developers to surface this app store transparency, so that users can kind of see some details of the data being collected before the user downloads the app. And so HP has also acquired HyperX, which is a gaming company. And personally, gaming is something I'm super excited about. And I'm very excited to see the growth in that area. So kind of one of the themes of this talk is that security and privacy programs within for-profit businesses are a balance between the amount of risk you incur and the amount of profit you might lose or leave on the table, so to speak. Each company has its own profit model and threat profiles. And so, for instance, some companies rely a lot more on selling advertisements. Other companies rely a lot more on actually selling products. And that can create a big difference, in kind of the amount of profit they lose when adopting stronger privacy principles. So how you can mitigate risk without impacting revenue is always going to be a big question. The maximum GDPR fine at Apple was $8.8 billion, but there were also times, right, where we'd make suggestions and we would get yelled at about how, we'd be costing the company $300 million or something like that, right? And both of those numbers are huge amounts of money compared to, the amount of money I'm making or have or deal with on a daily basis. And so it's definitely not a pleasant experience to get yelled at about how, you're going to cost the company $300 million. And do you really think, you're going to be able to make up that much? And so can you turn cost centers into competitive advantages? And I think this is one of the biggest things that you'll see with Apple, is that they've managed to establish privacy as a differentiator. And so because they've done that, right, you can make a lot stronger of an argument, hey, we're using privacy and security in our marketing materials. And a lot of the reason that people buy iPhone is because, it's the premier security and privacy protecting device. And so that gives you a stronger case versus, if you're making your money from ads and nobody kind of sees you as a privacy company, well, then all you do really is avoid fines. And so security and privacy at most businesses, and kind of an exception here will be businesses that are consulting firms for those disciplines specifically. But most businesses, the profit model isn't privacy or security. And so you have to figure out how you can either do the best privacy and security you can without impacting the profit model, or how you can integrate privacy and security into the profit model. And if you are a part of a business that can figure out how to do the second one, I think that offers you a lot of advantages in terms of building your privacy and security program. So this is the head of the German Data Protection Authority. And he said, data protection must become a real competition parameter for smart TVs and other communication-enabled IoT devices. And so what he has done is they've investigated the smart TV industry over the last several years, and they are increasingly, creating more consent and transparency requirements specific for those devices. And that's because they feel, consumer choice is what will drive better privacy and security protections. And it's only through informed consumers that, can consumers make informed choices. And this is a tweet back from 2015, which I've always found very interesting. And this person compares the Samsung Smart TV privacy policy with 1984, which kind of famously has these video screens in people's rooms that are always listening to them. And, this is the type of thing where, this was consumer awareness and potential pressure applied kind of outside the law. And so while I think the law is great and can do a lot toward spurring companies into compliance, at the end of the day, consumers have the most power, I think, to change company behavior. And so that's part of why privacy and security education, not just for specialists, but also for consumers in general, I think will do more to help the discipline than anything else. And part of the problem for that is sometimes, when regulations are written, a lot of times they're not written especially well. Oftentimes they're written by politicians who think things like, you can legislate the laws of mathematics out of existence. And so companies can either have a really hard time complying with these poorly written regulations, or they can, essentially comply with them without actually strengthening privacy and security for the user very much at all. So some of the things I would say to you as you go into the field is communication is really key. Definitely having technical expertise is extremely valuable for a lot of positions. But one of the first interviews I had, they basically said, cybersecurity is fundamentally a sales problem, because you can have the best solution ever, but if you can't convince anyone to use it, it doesn't do any good. And so I didn't entirely agree with that sentiment that it's a sales problem. That company basically did cybersecurity sales and lobbying to government. So, I can kind of see why they felt that way. But I definitely agree with the sentiment. If you can't convince your organization to adopt security protections that you propose, it doesn't do you any good. And so kind of in line with learning when to contribute, most often when it's your turn to contribute, it's because you can contribute in a way that drives progress. And you should learn how to contribute in a way that drives progress. One time, I was on a very active email thread. We were trying to get something done. The thread, had like 5 teams on it, and it reached 189 emails before, and nothing was resolved, right? We just sent 189 emails talking about stuff. And, my boss sat me down and he was like, this is unacceptable. You need to either be able to drive a resolution over email quicker, or you need to get set up a meeting or get on the phone, right? You can't just and if you have a meeting, right, you need to drive to a resolution. And if you can't get a clean resolution at that meeting, you need to establish clear action items from that meeting, to drive things forward. Companies aren't paying you to just write articles or whatever, unless that's kind of your work output. They're paying you to make progress and affect change in shipping products, really. And so one of the things that I found that can help to drive progress is something called bottom line up front. And this is basically where you put the most important things at the start of the email. And so, for instance, action items and open questions tend to be the most important things you're sending. And kind of the way you're taught to write in school, right, is, you have the introduction, and then you kind of build up to something, and then you'll have the conclusion, and then you might have some questions there. And a lot of the time, people are just really busy and they're getting a ton of emails. If I took a couple of days off at Apple, I would come back to thousands of emails. And so additionally, a lot of times people are looking at these emails on their phones now. And so if they can see kind of what they need to do out of this email, just looking at kind of the snippet on their phone, that's extremely helpful. And then if there's more information in the email that they need to read to answer that, a lot of times, they will go and do so. And so I think having a clear plan of record, understanding what open questions exist and what action items exist are all extremely beneficial to kind of driving projects forward. And I would say during the current time, written communication is even more important than ever before. Somewhere about June, I would say, we had a big meeting about how much time everyone was spending in Zoom meetings. I think at that time, our CEO had spent something like 50,000 minutes in Zoom over just a couple months. And so we made kind of an active effort to cut down on how many meetings we're having. I'm still spending, a half day or a full day in Zoom, probably at least 3 days a week. But for me personally, I work really hard to try and, create documentation and write emails so that, if someone sets up a meeting with me and emails me about an open question, I try and be able to email them back in such a way that I answer that question and they're able to cancel the meeting, or that, when we go into the meeting, all the background information has been established, and then we can just go in and talk through anything that's still unclear. And so I think part of this is taking a real responsibility for being understood by your audience. I think especially as, kind of fresh graduates, you may underestimate how much you know compared to other people in different disciplines. And so, for instance, someone who's been in marketing for 10 or 15 years may not necessarily have the level of familiarity with something like databases, as a junior CS student. And so when you're trying to communicate things that are important, you really want to try your best to understand the audience you're talking to and the way to communicate it in a way that they will understand. And so I think some really useful skills to build, especially as you're coming up on graduating, if you want to go into this industry, are an understanding of cloud infrastructure providers and tools. And AWS has been the most common and fully featured in my experience. And so Tinder is completely on AWS. Netflix, completely on AWS. The fintech startup, completely on AWS. Now, Apple and HP, they both use AWS, not to the same extent, and they mostly tend to use it kind of as cold storage. But certainly, if you want to work at Apple specifically, build your understanding of iCloud specifically. But if you build kind of AWS as a generalist and then, you go there, it definitely helps you understand kind of, how servers communicate and those types of things. And so I definitely would recommend creating your own AWS account, logging the console occasionally, taking a look at things like security groups and the other things they make available to you. And so having an understanding of device data collection mechanisms and network traffic analysis is something that I found extremely useful, both in security and in privacy. At the end of the day, a lot of security risks are around data exfiltration, and then a lot of privacy risks are, it's still data exfiltration, but it's kind of by your company in a way that, the user might not necessarily expect or hasn't been fully disclosed on. And so being able to see what data is actually coming off of the device is extremely useful. And so I use Burp Suite for that, and I highly recommend you guys develop some understanding of kind of that discipline. And so if you can understand when and how to apply, certain security or privacy tools, techniques, or design patterns, that also can really benefit you. A lot of the things that exist now in terms of design patterns and things like that, some of the great books that are out there, they didn't exist, 20 years ago. And some of them, didn't exist when I graduated school. And I found, the older a company is, kind of the more you can apply these things. I have found, production systems still running on flat file databases written in like the 80s, something that a junior in college now wouldn't write, but just because there was the lack of knowledge and lack of sharing back then, it's never been upgraded. But then even things like, don't repeat yourself and things like that, in newer companies, there are still opportunities to kind of implement some of those programming principles if you're aware of them and when they should be applied. And then something that I think is extremely, kind of necessary for these for-profit businesses is to be able to track work and meet deadlines. And so Jira is an extremely common work tracking mechanism. It's by Atlassian, and Confluence is its common wiki counterpart. And so you can kind of create your own Jira and Confluence. They allow you like a couple users and things like that. You can toy around with it if you want to learn a little more about it. What's kind of funny is that the companies I've worked at that have Jira and Confluence, they tend to have out of date versions of Jira and Confluence compared to kind of the cloud solutions you get exposed to. So, oftentimes the free version you get online will be more feature complete than the actual version you're working for, day to day, which is kind of interesting. And so one of the great things about privacy especially, but kind of security as well, is it's an evolving landscape. So currently there's the e-privacy directive, the GDPR, and CCPA, and many of these were passed recently or went into effect very recently, right? And so for me, I started working at Tinder in 2016. The GDPR was passed in 2016, and super early on, some journalists came to us basically like, hey, we want this data access. And so we started building that extremely early. And so I have exposure to the GDPR about as early as anyone else, right? It doesn't matter if they've been in the industry 30 years. The law was passed in 2016, went into effect 2018, so that, they can't have exposure for it for 20, 30 years longer than me, like they can certain other things, such as relational databases or something like that. And then that's continuing to evolve, right? California's passing new laws, other states are passing new laws. The e-privacy regulation has kind of gone into the next phase of approval, and so that will replace the e-privacy directive. And so, if you just read the e-privacy directive, read the e-privacy regulation draft, and come up with, a list of here's what I think the changes are, definitely that doesn't make you a lawyer, and a lot of companies won't be interested in your legal opinion. But even just doing that, right, will put you really far ahead in your understanding of a lot of people, including, some people are on the field, because for me, from day to day, right, I'm working on doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. And so while I've looked through the e-privacy regulation draft, as much as I want to kind of come up with a list of the differences, I haven't had the time to do that. So I definitely recommend making kind of use of the fact that, these things are available to you online. Hopefully you have a fair amount of free time while you're still college students, And, if you can just read what's out there, you can really learn so much. And so one of the things that I certainly hope to see in my lifetime, but we'll see if it happens, as well as whether or not it will be well crafted, or maybe merely to preempt stricter state laws, is a federal privacy regulation, or cybersecurity law. And if that happens, right, it'll be a whole new day in the privacy uh, industry for American tech companies, right? Currently, there's laws in different states, in China, Russia, India, and then obviously Europe is kind of the strongest um, that we look to the most. But if America had one, we'd probably look to America first in establishing our global frameworks. And so, that's the potential for a real game changer that could happen, in my lifetime, in your lifetime. And if that happens, in a lot of ways, it will be as close to a full reset as you can get, right? And so if you're able to get ahead on kind of learning how that will be implemented, you'll be on even footing with anybody else in the industry. And so as I've kind of, been in this industry, there have been some new scandals and new precedents that are set. So, for instance, Cambridge Analytica was a big one. One of the impetuses for my talk is I have a cousin who's recently graduated, and he asked me for some of my thoughts like this. And I've never felt as old as when he told me about learning about Cambridge Analytica in school, because that's something I lived through in the industry, and I hear that now. They're teaching about it in classes. So that's something, right? That was when I was in school. It hadn't happened, um, and it changed the privacy landscape. It changed the way companies look at data sharing with third parties, especially. And so that's something that kind of, you've been taught, that I wasn't taught. I just kind of lived through. And so it'll be very interesting to see how kind of the industry is informed by what happens next. And so another one that was fairly recent was the Planet 49 decision in the EU. And that has definitely changed the privacy posture of some companies. And so I'd say if you're not familiar with these type of things, definitely, it's all out there on the internet, and do some research. Thank you all for attending. And then one of the other things I'd like to mention is kind of the Microsoft Exchange server hack that's going on right now, right, is another thing that's super interesting. That, there are people even in some of our infrastructure security groups who aren't responsible for Exchange servers, who haven't really heard about it, because they don't have time to keep up with it when they're trying to keep up with all this other stuff. And so that's something that I definitely recommend if you're interviewing in security right now, or even if you just have a general interest in it. Take a look at what's been going on with that, because it is something that I think is super interesting.
Awesome. Did anyone have any questions for Alex here? I had a question, Alex.
All right.
So I know you mentioned, there's new legislation in California, but do you think if something like the GDPR were to gain traction either in the federal level or even just in California, we saw with like Prop 22 where these big companies were able to just pour money in and to sway the public opinion in their favor. Do you think something similar might happen if these laws might, affect these companies' bottom line? Do you think something similar might happen with, Prop 22 and privacy laws?
I mean, it's definitely always a concern, right? And, I'm not a politician or a lawyer. It certainly seems like there's a lot of money in American politics right now, right? And there are certain things, even in the GDPR, right, that in in tech they'll tell you, oh, that doesn't really need to be in the law, but Google lobbied for it to be in the law because they thought it would be harder for Facebook to comply with than it
Right.
would be for Google to comply with. And so it would both cost them more from a compliance perspective, and then open them up more to kind of losing users, or what have you. once they actually had that feature implemented. And so I think that's something that's always going on, right? Even in Europe, right? There's a group called Digital Europe, which is always lobbying for kind of on behalf of the for-profit tech industry there, right? To try and make sure, that if there are privacy protections, they're done in a way that they would say makes sense, but sometimes it really is just damages profits as little as possible.
Yeah. Anyone else have any questions here? Well, really interesting talk, Alex. Thank you. I myself am a pretty big privacy advocate. So, thank you for your work in GDPR and the Apple stuff too. I'm an Apple user. I love to see all that stuff. So thank you. Very, very interesting stuff, Alex.
All right, thanks.